professor at Gonzaga University in the history department, and I am the president of the Spokane Society of the AIA. It has been my pleasure to be one of many volunteers who have brought this series to you over the years, and we're very pleased to continue this year in spite of the fact that we have continued to be online, but more about that in a few minutes. This evening is a live presentation, and recording is strictly prohibited. The AIA respects the intellectual property of its presenters and asks that the viewers do the same. And we thank you for your cooperation. We will be recording this, and I'm very pleased to say that we have begun a site in which these recordings will be posted, at least for a limited time. So for those of you who can't stay for the full presentation, or perhaps have problems with connectivity, or perhaps can't make it this evening, if you know someone, you can certainly let them know. And we'll be putting information on our website, which is on Facebook. Again, more on that in a second. The AIA is familiar to many of you. We make archaeology happen, and we've been doing it a very long time. In fact, we're approaching 150 years, and it's a large organization with over 200,000 members worldwide, composed of archaeologists, educators, excavators, and many, many public members who have joined us on site, who have joined us for trips, and so forth. We are all about archaeology and engaging in archaeology. And we have several publications for those of you who would like to read more. Archaeology Magazine is the one which is most often found on the newsstands. Now, there's also the American Journal of Archaeology, which is our premier journal. That is now available electronically. And you can get copies of that as well, both of which provide highlights of some of the most important recent finds in the Mediterranean and around the world. The AIA does quite a bit, including tours, providing fieldwork opportunities for students or others. There's no age limit to being an excavator. Fieldwork opportunities that allow people to go around the world. We have a national society as well as our local societies and other collaborating organizations. There has been tours in the past, and hopefully those will be starting up again soon. You can find information about those at our website, www.archaeological.org, which you see at the bottom of the page. And there's a great amount of material there, all kinds of ways you can become involved if you wish with the AIA. Your membership does go to support our AIA lecture series. And for those of you who are perhaps considering the idea of becoming a member, I encourage you to do so. Information can be found on the www.archaeological.org site. We have a local Facebook page. Join us, like us. I guess I should change this to Meta. We have a local Meta page now. And we're hoping soon, probably over the next couple of months, to have up a local AIA website, our very own website, our very own web page, to bring you more current information about archaeology in our region and with the AIA. If you have questions for our speakers, don't hesitate to type them into the chat box, and you can do so at any time during this talk. We hope that you will take a moment as you are listening to post a question, or perhaps if you'd like to wait to the end to post your question then. And Dr. Conrad has very generously agreed to offer questions, to take questions at the end. So please keep that in mind. For those of you who are joining us, we do have closed caption. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Zoom, you simply go to the bottom of the page, which you can see down here with the closed caption sign, and you can bring up the icon and you can set it to small or large lettering, as you can see here. There's a number of different sizes to, well, make this easier for those of you who perhaps are having problems with connectivity, or you simply like to use the subtitles. So please don't forget that we have that. The AIA has managed to do quite well over the last couple of years, bringing in a growing number of speakers each year. And we're able to do that through the generosity of a number of donors who have either this year or continuously funded us. And we remain very grateful for the support of those in our community who have helped to make this happen. And so once again, if you do wish to support the AIA, we are always looking for more help. We are approaching our 75th anniversary, and that will be, we hope, an opportunity for us to put on a really rich and hopefully fun series of events linked to archaeology. But we'll be talking more about that in the future. What I'm most pleased to say, there are really two things I'm pleased to say this evening as I'll finish up. The first is to announce the board has met and we have discussed it. And we have practiced at the MAC, and we are now ready to present a hybrid lecture on April 21st. Our next speaker will be Dr. Stephen Nash from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, who will speak about repatriation, 15 years on the arc of restorative justice at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. He has very gratefully, we're very grateful that he has agreed to come to Spokane, our first speaker since February 2020. So it's been a long time, over 2 years. So we will be back at the MAC, I'm very pleased to say. And for those of you who have been waiting to get back into the seats, of course, COVID is receding, we hope. And of course, there is always a chance that we might not be able to do this. We will keep you updated, and you can find the updates on Facebook. But for now, we are planning to do a hybrid lecture. And for those of you who would like to stay online, there will be that opportunity. For those of you who would like to join us in person, we will also be having our regular third Thursday lecture at 6:30 p.m. at the MAC. So I do hope that you'll join us. I can't wait to see all of you. It's been far, far too long. So one good piece of news. And the next thing that I'm very pleased to do is to introduce our speaker for this evening. I met Cyler several years ago, and we have stayed in touch. It's been wonderful to have a colleague just down in New Mexico, and someone who is doing a tremendous range of different projects, which means that we can keep inviting him back. Some of you might remember in 2019, his wonderful talk at Thanksgiving time about turkey cultivation in the New World. And so we're or domestication, I should say, we're very, very pleased that he'll join us once again in 2022. He is an anthropologist and archaeologist who studies human, animal, and human environmental relationships in mainland South Asia, California, New Mexico, and the Galapagos Islands. He received his PhD from the University of New Mexico and is currently an adjunct assistant professor of archaeology at UNM. He's the co-author of numerous articles, book chapters, opinion essays, and blogs that focus on aspects of animals, subsistence, and environments in the archaeological record. And he has, when you look over his CV, it's a tremendous range of different things. Contamination in gold rush era native Pacific oysters, Holocene hunter-gatherer subsistence patterns in Thailand and Malaysia, eggshell bone isotopes and turkey husbandry, and Pueblo fishing in the middle Rio Grande of New Mexico. He seems to be doing things all over the map. And so we were talking about possible topics, and I had noticed that he had been doing some very interesting work on World War II and prehistoric Thailand. So I was very, very pleased when he agreed to join us this time round, and to speak on a new subject, and one I think is quite interesting, entitled "An Archaeologist, World War II and Prehistoric Thailand." So please welcome everyone, virtual clap for Dr. Cyler Conrad.
Thank you, Andy. I hope everyone can hear me okay, I hope. I'm gonna assume that's a yes. Let me share my screen here. Thank you, Andy, Cindy, to the Society as well. I really enjoy being able to talk to everyone, especially with Spokane being my hometown. It's quite special to be able to have this opportunity. So thank you so much again. Thanks for having me. And I will assume that this is working successfully, but someone jump in and stop me if I'm moving along and there's some issues. So tonight, I really wanted to talk about something which is it's integrated with my own research, my archaeological research in Thailand and mainland Southeast Asia. There's a personal aspect of this, though, and in the way in which I was inspired to sort of take a track in archaeology and in history and anthropology. And it really all focuses and is tied to this record of the Second World War, human activities within Southeast Asia during that time, and how that intersects with the archaeological record. And so this is a sort of a new talk for me. I've never given this before, but it's something that's really important. And I'm quite excited to be able to be here and to share this with all of you. And again, there are some personal sides of this that I'll talk about with my own journey and experience in archaeology. And I hope that you might be able to relate and gain from this. And if anything, you might walk away and if you watch the Hollywood film, The Bridge on the River Kwai, you might see it in a much different light after this. So hopefully that's a good thing. Okay, let's begin here. Okay, so just gonna, apologies, move some things out of the way here. So the contents of this talk, I want to talk about three broad and related topics. So I first want to talk about what's known as a China-Burma-India theater during World War II. This is really the area that I'm going to be discussing, and the focus of a lot of this, the film, the Hollywood film, of course, the experience of the prisoners of war in Thailand during this time. But I want to set the stage for what was going on. I want to talk also about a very specific Dutch archaeologist who was a prisoner of war in these camps that are, of course, again, dramatized and depicted in the film. I want to talk about what happened on that railroad, some just tragic circumstances for the prisoners of war at that time, and then how this relates to the film itself. And then hopefully I can wrap this up and in a coherent and interesting way and sort of talk a little bit more about the legacy of war and archaeology within Southeast Asia. And that's where I think that there's a really important and interesting component of this record and the human experience within this area. And it ties together in, I think, a meaningful and intriguing way. And so I really hope to talk about this. I'm going to be showing several images throughout here. These are photographs that are depicting prisoners of war. They're also drawings. Like this drawing is showing prisoners of war working on the railroad. A lot of this work was done by hand. So these are pilings that they're trying to drive in to create one of the numerous bridges. We'll talk about this, but I do have a warning at one point. There's a graphic image that I'll show, a particularly graphic one. And so I'll call that out. You'll see a little red warning box, but I just wanted to mention that because again, I wanted to give a really true sort of authentic experience for you to understand what it was like during that time and again, how this relates to the film and this broader record within the region. So when we talk about the China-Burma-India theater during World War II, or the CBI, it's really known as a forgotten theater of the war, similar to how the Korean War is sort of this forgotten war of the 20th century. But we're talking about this area essentially encompassing portions of China, mainland Southeast Asia, or at that time it was known as French Indochina, Burma, which is today known as Myanmar, also portions of India. And this theater is just a very large area. The Allies at that time had a lot of different sort of nation states that were fighting and that were contributing to the war effort. And so the United States played a role in this theater, and I'll talk about this, but the British, for example, the Dutch, the Australians had a really significant role, and they experienced a lot of what I'm going to talk about. The circle right here in Thailand, this represents the location where this Thai Burma, this railroad of death was constructed through the jungles of essentially Western Thailand and sort of that southeastern portion of Burma. We'll talk about this. I also wanted to highlight this here. This is where I want to talk about the cruiser, the USS Houston. I'll bring this up here shortly. She was sunk along with an Australian cruiser right here in the Sunda Strait. And this is all within Indonesia, right off of the island of Java. here's Australia down here. And of course, Hawaii and Pearl Harbor, which really kind of instigated the United States involvement in the war. This is another map of the CBI, as it's known, this theater during the war. One of the critical elements that, again, the Allies during this time, one of the critical elements, the reasons that they were fighting in this theater, is that they were trying to find a route to supply China. Oh, my apologies. To supply China during this time. China was essentially under siege by the Japanese. They had invaded in the north and the east. And China, the Allies at that time, and I'm talking about the United States and Britain and European allies, for example, really knew that China needed to survive. China could not fall, or that would have really dramatic consequences for the war effort around the world. India, for example, some of these former British colonies, India and Burma, of course, they were being attacked. The Japanese had invaded, they had taken Burma. And so the Allied effort in this theater was really an attempt to try and help supply China and put a stop to Japanese sort of advances in this part of Southeast, but also really South Asia. And so there was a lot of combat in northern Burma and also essentially Western Burma and these portions of Eastern India. It was quite a dramatic portion of the war effort, but again, it's sort of this forgotten theater. A lot of people may have only heard of it fleetingly, or perhaps only through the Hollywood film, which is why I had such an interest in this. And so you can see here the roads that were constructed, very infamous roads. The Lado Road and also the Burma Road, which were, the desire here, the goal was to find a route to transport goods and material into China, because of course the way that the Allies were able to transport material to China prior to the completion of these roads was by airlift over what was known as the hump, essentially a portion of the Himalayan mountain range through here. It was extraordinarily dangerous. A lot of pilots died. A lot of people lost their lives just trying to fly goods into China during this time. And so an overland route was really critical to this effort. And again, when we talk about the railroad of death, as it's known, we're talking about this region of Southeast Asia. And so I'll be talking about this, and we'll see some other maps. Did this load? There we go. So this is a photo of me and a veteran named Robert Haroldson. This is a much different time. This is 2005, so many years ago. I was in high school at the time, and I really had the privilege and honor of being able to interview Bob, as he was known as he went by. Bob had quite an experience. So he was a World War II veteran. He, prior to the war, prior to Pearl Harbor, he was in essentially the Washington National Guard, the 161st Infantry. He, if I understand this correctly, I was reviewing my interview notes with him from way back when. He essentially was in San Francisco preparing to board a troop transport to the Philippines so that he could support MacArthur's war effort and essentially defense of the Philippines on December 7th, on 1941. And so, of course, the news hit and their plans immediately changed. So he was sent to Hawaii for some training. Eventually, though, he had a really interesting experience where the Army was looking for competent skiers. And so they had a sort of a kind of a test of skiing abilities on Mount Rainier, and Bob was a great skier. He passed with some of his friends, and so he eventually became part of the 10th Mountain Division. And then this was in 1942. He decided to volunteer for combat overseas and joined a really well-known famous unit called Merrill's Marauders, which was commanded by a U.S. General, Frank Merrill, and they were known as the 5307th Composite Unit. And this was really, you can think of it today as a precursor to the U.S. Army Rangers, essentially. They were a type of unit. They were all volunteer. They were one of only 2 units, American combat units, that actually fought on the ground within Asia, within mainland Asia. Something to think about. Of course, we know about all of these just tragic and consequential battles on the islands of the Pacific, but American units actually fighting in Asia were few and far between. Merrill's Marauders were one of them. They were followed by the Mars Task Force. And all of these units, Bob, where he served and where he fought, was in Myanmar, essentially in Burma and northern Burma during the war. And so when I interviewed him back in 2005, and this was for a high school project, Bob really shared quite a lot with me about his experience during that time, sort of some of the awful circumstances that he served under, as all of the other combat veterans during that time experienced. The tropical weather, the disease, the lack of fresh water, the challenge to get food, hiking everywhere, trying to essentially cut your own path through the jungle to then constantly engage the Japanese. They essentially were a form of guerrilla warfare, or an early form of special operations units that were fighting within Burma at that time, sort of cut off from a very traditional type of military engagement. And so there was no, I think something we talked about, there was no leave to liberated Paris, for example. These soldiers, these veterans, the work and the experience they had fighting in Burma, it was a very difficult time. And so this really interested me in this region of the world, and interested me in the type of experience of veterans during that time, and really what happened during World War II within Southeast Asia. And this, again, is going to tie into some things. But I wanted to introduce Bob. I'm going to talk about his story a little bit through this process. But again, here's a really famous image from the National Archives, U.S. Army. Those Merrill's Marauders, they were roughly 3,000 strong, 3,000 volunteers. You can see here, this is just a classic bamboo bridge across one of the numerous rivers, streams, and aquatic features, I think is safe to say, that are found within Southeast Asia, and especially Burma. And so these were units that were fighting with mules. They were getting supplied by mules, for example. This was a challenging environment, and they were constantly battling the jungle alongside the Japanese. And it's important to note that the Japanese had it no better or no worse. They were also constantly fighting the jungle and their environment, while they were also trying to engage Allied forces. And so this was really just a war on multiple fronts. And at one point, Bob told me a story about someone in his unit who essentially broke down, just the psychological impact. And he said, that is someone who was another casualty of the war. That is someone who's still a casualty. They don't have a physical type of injury, but they are suffering the same, just as all of us, through this constant stream of combat, whether it's with disease or just the jungle that they're trying to survive in. This is an example of the road that they're working on. You can see here, here's for scale, probably a truck, I imagine. This is just, this is the environment within northern Burma. This is this environment on the essentially the edge of the Himalayas. This is a jungle, mountainous, high elevation for Southeast Asia environment, and it is a treacherous area. It is not easy. And so Allied engineers were essentially cutting this road from scratch through the jungle, just by hand with the equipment and the tools that they had. Luckily for the folks working on the road, they had heavy equipment that they could use, but the mud and the monsoons and the rain, it just was a constant struggle. I think this is another really powerful image. In fact, when I first saw this image, my mind immediately went to sort of thoughts of Vietnam and the war 2 decades after this. Sort of this idea of just cutting these roads through the jungle. I mean, this is what they were up against, and this is the type of environment that, of course, Bob fought in, that Allied soldiers and Japanese soldiers fought in during this time. But this is also the environment where POWs were forced to use essentially no tools and no heavy equipment to create this railroad. That's the focus of course, this fictionalized movie, The Bridge on the River Kwai. And this is really critical. The conditions were so brutal. This is U.S. medics treating some injured British soldiers. You can see here, I mean, there's the flames. This is an active combat zone. This is in November of '44. There was a lot of combat going on during this time. For every one Allied casualty of the war, 14 others essentially were either killed or wounded due to a huge number of diseases and infections and other types of ailments that were not related at all to combat. But that's just the nature of this environment that they were fighting within. And again, I mention this, I want to bring this up because these are the conditions that combat soldiers, with the support of nation states and the war material that they could provide during this time, and they still were suffering essentially 1 to 14 ratio of casualties due to some of these conditions. And so you can imagine where I'm going with this is just the awful situation that prisoners of war experienced while they were in these Japanese camps. Oops. Okay, so I after interviewing Bob, sort of taking this journey, this interest in Southeast Asia, I really began to eventually focus on history and archaeology. And this was going through school, working on my degrees. And I have always been fascinated. And this is where this intersection of some of these topics really begin. With an archaeologist, a Dutch archaeologist, he is here in the middle, Hendrik van Heekeren, who essentially was born in Java, so born in Indonesia, but he was Dutch. He was from the Hollands and Netherlands, and he is. I'm sort of getting caught up in my words because there's a lot to say about him. He is a remarkable character. He's here with two also actually famous colleagues of his during this time. But he had a really kind of self-taught amateur interest in archaeology from a young age. He's self-funded. He went out essentially in Indonesia, especially in Java, and conducted a lot of archaeological work, some early excavations. He was just really intrigued by this. And when the Japanese invaded Java, this was in 1942, he was 40 years old, and he was essentially captured. The Japanese captured and imprisoned a lot of what you might consider civilians, essentially government type of employees. And so he was captured in 1942 on Java. So this is sort of setting the stage. I want to talk about his life and his experience. But I just want everyone to understand sort of his perspective. So he went into this as a 40-year-old man, sort of as a prisoner of war, and eventually ended up on the camps in Thailand. I also wanted to quickly mention that when Java was invaded by the Japanese, they essentially had a two-pronged invasion for East and West Java. And at this time, this was just a few months. This was March of 1942. So a few months after the United States even entered the war, just a few months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese at this point were really, they had not been matched or stopped within the Pacific. They were invading, they were attacking, and they were progressing quite successful. The Allies were really sort of in disarray, and Java had, at one point, I made this note down here, the Lost Battalion from the Texas National Guards. These were artillerymen who were essentially en route to the Philippines. They ended up in Java as well. They became prisoners of war. There were some Navy vessels, and this is where the USS Houston ties in. The Houston, and also she was a cruiser. The cruiser, the HMAS Perth out of Australia, although she was originally a British cruiser. They were here supporting this sort of a hodgepodge of naval vessels that were trying to defend this portion of island Southeast Asia from the inevitable Japanese attack. And of course, it was unsuccessful. They knew that. And on the night of February 28th, 1942, the cruisers left this port over here in Western Java. They tried to sail through the Sunda Strait to essentially escape. They wanted to make it down here to the southern part of Java so that they could load up individuals, equipment, and make a run for Australia. So this inset map over here again, they were trying to make it to Darwin. They essentially wanted to evacuate and escape. They knew that the Japanese were about to invade, and they knew that it was inevitable what would happen. They did not make it successfully. They essentially encountered by accident the Japanese invasion force right at the mouth of the Sunda Strait, and engaged with the Japanese Navy. Here's an interesting sort of depiction of the course of the battle. This is from the Australian National Maritime Museum. They've done some work, especially for the Perth. The US Navy has also done some work for the Houston. But as they were trying to make it through Sunda Strait, which is right over here, they were essentially spotted by Japanese destroyers and sort of a large group of Japanese Navy vessels. The transports were essentially landing individuals and equipment on the shore the next morning. And when they engaged the Japanese, this was late at night on February 28th, and the battle went into the early morning of the 1st. You can see here that the Perth was sunk just after midnight, but just before the Houston. This is an important part of the story because of how it ties into the Railroad of Death and this prisoner experience. But both of these vessels, it's remarkable that they were able to engage the Japanese. They were both sunk, of course. Many sailors, many souls were lost. But the Japanese had a difficult time sinking them. And in fact, they launched dozens of torpedoes during this engagement and sunk some of their own transports along the shore. They sunk some of their own vessels just essentially through friendly fire. But of course, they they also sunk the Perth and the Houston. This is an interesting area right here, sort of entering the Sunda Straits. They were so close to shore, they were so close to land, and yet the Sunda Strait was so powerful and strong that although there were roughly 400 survivors that essentially made it through, there were likely, some estimates are several hundred more survivors that actually survived the sinking, the immediate sinking of, in this case, the Houston, but were either killed by the Japanese and the water. They were essentially swept out to sea, swept into the Indian Ocean, never to be seen again. It's really sort of a tragic set of consequences and sort of tragic set of events for what happened to both the Perth and the Houston. But again, the Houston, it had essentially 368 survivors. They became prisoners of war, roughly 700 killed, and this is an image of her. This is also the Perth, similar type of situation, about 300 survivors and almost 400 killed. So these sailors, once they were captured, especially on land, on either at sea or when they made it ashore to Java, they also became prisoners and may or may not have been in similar or related prison camps with Van Heekeren. So this is an interesting part of the story where there's an intersection between essentially this civilian who is an archaeologist and becomes even a sort of more famous archaeologist after the war, but he is experiencing the Second World War alongside essentially allied sailors and soldiers, all the same. And so there's a lot of connection here. What happened to these prisoners of war is just a disturbing and sometimes shocking story to understand. They were kept imprisoned on Java for a short period of time through 1942, but then they were sent essentially en masse to Thailand, into Burma, to work on this new Japanese engineering project to construct a railroad between 1942 and it ended in 1943, the construction of the railroad, that is, between Thailand and Burma. So this is a really remarkable railroad, this railroad of death, as it's known. It was essentially 258 miles long. Again, talking about the jungle, talking about this tropical environment, had over 600 bridges. And remember that this entire span of the railroad, all of these bridges, everything was constructed by hand. It was just it was backbreaking work. So many died. Of roughly 60,000 Allied prisoners of war who were forced to work on the railroad, it's estimated that about 16,000 died. But again, these numbers are so difficult to quantify because the Japanese were not really interested in keeping these records. They did not keep these records. Something that happened in the history of especially sailors from the Houston. This is documented quite well from the survivors. But there would be, they would start at various locations along the railroad. They would send out groups into the jungle, into just sort of an untouched environment. And they would have them essentially hike miles, kilometers into the jungle along the line. And then they would essentially create their own camp out of nothing. And so you can imagine that this was a type of experience and a type of environment that was unrelenting. And so often there are stories where entire camps of POWs would just mysteriously essentially die. And often it was from disease or some other type of calamity that would take out entire sections of POWs at a time. And so it was really difficult. The burials, keeping logs, keeping track of who was there and who died was a challenge. And of course, the other side of the story, which is even less known than the military prisoners of war, were the civilians. So the Burmese people, the Thai people, the local indigenous peoples who were forced by the Japanese to work and construct this railroad, maybe roughly 300,000. Again, these are estimates. Folks really don't know. And it's estimated that about 100,000 died. I mean, the conditions were just atrocious during this time. And very similar to, say, the Burma Road, which Bob and others, the Merrill's Marauders and the Allies were trying to construct and defend and essentially advance into China to provide another avenue to supply the Chinese in their fight against the Japanese. The Japanese were trying to find a way to supply their forces in Burma because of the really sort of overwhelming, what quickly became an overwhelming superiority by sea and by air from the Allies. And so the shipping lanes that would wrap from essentially, South China Sea, the Gulf of Siam, around the Andaman Sea. They would wrap around the Thai Malay Peninsula or the Malay Thai Peninsula, wrap around Singapore. Allies were constantly harassing the Japanese, and the Japanese were losing quite a lot of tonnage, essentially, in material. And so they wanted an overland route to try and essentially combat this really significant advantage that the Allies quickly had within this theater of the war. I could have shown this image right before this last slide. These hell ships. This is it's a part of the story which is really critical to share, but it's just again, it's such a small note to the broader experience that these POWs suffered. To get from Java essentially to this portion of Thailand and Burma, often the Japanese would put hundreds of prisoners within merchant vessels, essentially reused merchant vessels. They were called hell ships, and for a very good reason. This is a drawing from a survivor. There was often no sunlight. They were just in the hold of these vessels. There was very often no food or water. Dozens of individuals would die. They were cramped together. I mean, this is very similar to conditions that you might read or learn about for how the Nazis treated the Jewish populations in Europe during the Holocaust in train cars. It's a very similar type of comparison. There's a story from survivors from the USS Houston where it was clear that the previous voyage of their merchant ship was used to transport cattle. And so all of the refuse from the cattle, it wasn't cleaned out. They were just thrown into the hole with all of that. And they were forced for days on end to try and survive in these conditions. And the real tragedy is that the Japanese did not care to properly flag these vessels. And so the Allies inadvertently sunk and killed hundreds, sometimes thousands of their own their own people, their own soldiers, their own the POWs that were from these nations, because they had no idea that they were attacking vessels that were not just transporting Japanese goods for the war effort, for example. So the explanation of a hell ship, I think that's a really proper term for this. And this drawing, it's really difficult to imagine the conditions. I don't think it's possible unless you lived through those, but it was traumatic. And so the trauma of this transportation just to get to the railroad was just the beginning. And in some cases, this was much better than what was experienced on the railroad itself. Then, of course, we get to the POW experience of this railroad of death. It's hard to know actually where to begin in describing the conditions. You have to imagine, perhaps this might be easier if you visited sort of the tropics anywhere around the world, but you have to imagine sort of this tropical environment with a monsoon-driven climate, and so especially for half the year, you're getting doused in unrelenting rain. You have just an enormous amount of animals, vegetation. You have disease essentially around every corner. You're malnourished because the Japanese are not feeding you. You don't have access to clean water, and then there is just brute force physical abuse, which is being shown here. This is a drawing from a survivor, but also the brutal conditions, being forced to work well over 12 hours a day to construct this railroad. The Japanese wanted it done as quickly as possible to help support their war effort in broader, essentially Burma and also South Asia. This is an interesting drawing, not only for the tragedy of it, but it's helpful to see the elephant back here. This is important because, again, there was no heavy machinery. It was difficult enough to actually transport these prisoners of war to the railroad. They were forced essentially to march into the jungle and sort of start from scratch. And so they used a lot of elephants. And again, this is where the local civilian population came in and sort of they were equally brutalized and forced by the Japanese to participate in this construction. It's important to note that rarely in these camps, if you think about the movie, The Bridge on the River Kwai, sort of thinking about Japanese guards, rarely were guards actually ever needed. And they're almost, especially for camps that were further along the line, there was rarely a need for barbed wire or fencing or any type of restraint at all for the prisoners, because it was impossible for the prisoners to survive outside of the camp. I mean, the camp conditions were nearly impossible themselves. Many people died simply because of the poor conditions in the camps, but there was just, it was just a wall of jungle and disease and animals and vegetation, and the elements would have quickly killed prisoners of war who tried to escape. On a few occasions, people did, and they died if the Japanese did not essentially track them down first. And so this is an important part of this to note, is that they were essentially out there on their own in this environment. There are some photographs, but very few photographs from this time. So I'm going to go through some historic photographs now. Most of these are out of the Australian War Memorial. A Japanese surveyor visited the line in the POW camps in 1943. His collection essentially of images was picked up after the war in Thailand. So this is a rare look. I think this is sort of a ludicrous image in some ways, because of course you can see here the raincoats that these Japanese surveyors are using. And then of course, this individual gets the one single umbrella. And again, you might have had to visit a tropical environment to know, but one single umbrella in the tropical jungles of Burma and Thailand is not going to sort of last you very long or do much good. And so I think this is a sort of an interesting perspective on just the, what a juxtaposition of an item that you would see in a much different context, and yet here it is trying to protect this one Japanese surveyor from the elements in the rain, while literally hundreds of thousands of people are suffering in these elements trying to build this line. And of course, this is it's difficult to see in some of these images, but the jungle is right there. They cut a track through the jungle and through the mountains and across these rivers that was as small as possible to get the job done. This is essentially a cut bank. You can see here construction of the railroad. I think this is quite a powerful image as well, because you have to remember that all of this was dug out. All of the vegetation on top was cleared by hand. There are tools, there are shovels that these POWs are using, but often they were literally digging by hand or using rocks, for example. There was just not enough equipment. The Japanese did not provide any equipment, and yet they still had their sort of quotas for the amount of work that needed to be done. And so it is a remarkable feat of the human experience, of the human existence, that these POWs were able to complete this line. And something I should have mentioned when showing the map is that the POWs, they were separated in numerous camps throughout the railroad, throughout the line, but they started in Burma and Thailand essentially simultaneously. There was a little bit more developed infrastructure on the Thai side, but they were working together to try and join together. In a much different world, you can think of essentially the Transcontinental Railroad here in the United States. It's the same type of concept, trying to meet together in the middle. And they did have a ceremony once they did meet in the middle, just after thousands and thousands of people had perished trying to build this railroad line. You can see here, this is a well-known image, again, sort of Japanese guards. These are probably Australian prisoners of war that are just moving portions of the railroad to build this all by hand. Again, you talk about the remarkable feat of the architecture. This is all probably bamboo, and there are some other tree species essentially that would have been used, but it's quite strong, quite durable. And so the Japanese used all of this local material because they did not have the really the logistical support to move any other materials in. They did have to bring in metal components on some larger bridges and some additional components like that to sort of meet really challenging, unique situations. But most of this was cut by hand in the jungles and the forests around the line. It was all constructed by hand by these POWs and local civilian peoples. This is a powerful image as well. This is what's known as Hellfire Pass. This is a really infamous place in the landscape. It's difficult to imagine exactly what this would have been like. The stories, the survivors that wrote about this, these are essentially limestone karsts. These are limestone mountains that they're cutting through. The Japanese would dynamite areas to essentially blast through this limestone to create this very narrow line that would go through here. The Japanese, of course, would protect themselves before blasting, but often the blasting was unannounced. And so POWs were immediately killed from the blast, or the tiny and the chunks of limestone that would fly off of these faces of these limestone cliffs. They would injure POWs that were nearby. They would be peppered in essentially shrapnel from the environment. That would get infected. They would later die. It was just a nonstop, brutal process that would go day in, day out through the night to sort of create these spaces that the line could be built. And it was relentless, essentially. here are some other photos. So this is a camp kitchen. Again, tough to see exactly what's going on here, but I just wanted to mention the environment. I hope that's really something you can take away from this, is just the challenging conditions, the jungle literally right there. This is again, in different circumstances, different times, it might be possible to, and it is possible to sort of live within this environment. But when you're malnourished, when you don't have access to fresh water, when you're constantly injured, when you're being physically abused, and it is just a really difficult place to survive and to live. There was an Allied POW, I wanted to mention this, who actually snuck and kept a little brownie camera with him during this experience. And so there's a photo I'll show later, which is from his time. There were some remarkable prisoners that were able to keep certain items throughout this time. One that is noted in this history of the USS Houston survivors is, this is quite relevant for today, a Scotsman, essentially a Highlander, who was a POW, who kept a set of bagpipes during his time on the line. So I thought that's a special sort of note today with St. Patrick's Day. But again, this was really really difficult. It was hard enough to survive, much less keep any types of personal items or other types of items like radios that could be successfully hidden. Although the Allies and several POWs certainly did this and did so successfully. I wanted to show this image, which shows, as you can see, a lot of POWs bathing. Here's a waterfall coming down. They knew at the time they were trying to be as safe as possible, have everything go downstream, have everything they're washing off, all of the disease, cholera, dysentery, all of these parasites, all these infectious diseases. They spread so rampant throughout these populations. Dysentery was really just it killed many, many people essentially. I wanted to show this though, because what happened quite tragically sometimes is that, of course, different camps are working along the river. So they followed essentially the course of the river in many places. That's why there's so many bridges that were needed, as an example. Some people downstream did not realize, for example, when groups might have been bathing or using water or tossing human waste, for example, or other types of items into this water source. And so there was a constant cycle of contamination, of disease, and of reinfection with different groups of POWs, because there was no communication. They were living in these individual camps, isolated from one another. It was really, really quite difficult. And again, it killed so many POWs because of the conditions that they were living in at the time. This is, again, sort of the idea that this could be a hospital. It's just tragic to think about the circumstances. And many Allied POWs simply died from these diseases. But again, this is showing probably out back here is where there was a lot of, it's tough to know exactly. Some of the descriptions are, when you have such, for example, cholera or dysentery, it's difficult to walk, it's difficult to move. And so a lot of this, people were living within their own waste and within this filth that was created from these environments. And often the Japanese, when an entire camp might die from a disease, or usually it was the disease that was killing off people, they just had another group of POWs move in. They, sometimes would become reinfected. They would be living in this environment. The sanitary conditions, the POWs tried as well as they could, but it was just really challenging. This is a drawing from a survivor, this idea of these dysentery latrines. I think this is it's hard to see some of these images and try to, again, sort of imagine that experience, but just both the support between the POWs, sort of the experience that they were having, but just the struggle to survive. And, when I interviewed Bob, he of course came back with dysentery during the war, again, as a combat veteran. He told me this quote here when he was talking about dysentery. He said, "I think everyone in our outfit had amoebic dysentery before they got over there. That's part of the terror." And I think that that line is really critical, right? It's that's part of the terror, this experience. War itself is just such a shocking and violent trauma for the human experience. And yet there's a terror there that's underlying that you might not die from being shot or being stabbed or any of these other really violent ways that death occurs in war, but the terror of a disease, something that's microscopic that you can't see, that will kill you, and it will kill you in a slow and really brutal way. You know, Bob, when he came back, he went from about 200 pounds when he was deployed to Burma. He came back and he weighed about 145 pounds. He had lost about 55 pounds from dysentery. He was given essentially arsenic, some of these tablets and these emetine shots, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. The doctors accidentally overdosed him essentially on emetine, and they gave him so much and his body reacted quite violently. He was in the hospital, but after that, and this was when he was back in Spokane, back in the States after the war, he never had another bout of dysentery. So whatever they did with this combination of very strong chemicals into his body, they were able to beat it out. But I think that he was lucky. You know, he would tell me that the U.S. Army doctors told him at the time, the medics in Burma, that he would live with this for the rest of his life, and that it would probably take about 10 years off of his life. He would die prematurely from the dysentery, especially if it could not be treated. And at that time, they did not think it could be treated. I just wanted to mention this. There's a graphic photo coming up next, so just a warning here. These are tropical ulcers. So this was quite common for, again, POWs working along the line. This is from the POW who had snuck in his own camera and tried to record and document some of this. This is just ulcers on the legs. I'll spare you photos of ulcers on the rest of the body, but these are infections that get into the skin, cuts, other sort of activities, and they lead to just extreme pain, swelling, and death. This is really just an awful way to go. And these were the conditions that people were living in day to day in this environment. And you can see this is another photo taken by this POW with his camera. You can see the state of the POWs. They were so malnourished during this time. They just did not have access to adequate food or water. You know, when they were able to catch a fish from the river, that was just exciting. You know, that was a meal that they could have. They tried to catch and eat whatever they could around camp, but this is a challenging place to live in the jungle. There's an abundance of life in the jungle, an abundance of plants and vegetation and animal life, but it's quite difficult to capture, and even more difficult to know exactly what to capture and kill. And of course, the indigenous peoples living in these communities, they have that traditional knowledge, but for POWs who are thrown into this environment, some of them already injured. For example, folks from the USS Houston, some of those sailors had burns that were over 80-90% of their body. They somehow survived in POW camps just with essentially, towels and water and sort of, trying to keep them cool. And they were able to live through that experience to be sent into the jungle to work on these railroads. So it was just a really traumatic time for these individuals. So again, I've just perhaps overwhelmed you with some rather disturbing details about what life was really like for POWs during that time. But for Van Heekeren, his experience, it's both known and unknown. And I think this is perhaps my interest and kind of fascination with his story. You know, again, he was captured in Java in 1942. He was sent to work on the railroad in 1942 in Thailand. He worked on the Thai side. He was in Thailand until 1944. And then he was actually moved to a prisoner of war camp in Japan, in mainland Japan, from 44 to 45 before the war ended, and he was repatriated. But what's remarkable to me is that his experience, there was no way that his experience was any better than what I just described. He certainly suffered in those same ways, and perhaps different ways as well. But that environment that he lived in was so challenging. And yet he, in his writing after the war and what he talked about, he essentially completed archaeological work during that time. And there's some discussion, and historians have tried to approach this, and it's an interesting idea about when you're in such a traumatic type of environment, focusing on some of these very specific types of activities might be one way to essentially keep yourself sane and sort of survive through the ordeal. Some people collected insects and butterflies, for example. Some people painted while they were prisoners of war. Different types of hobbies and activities just to concentrate your mind. Again, it's difficult to imagine without living through this experience. But I think for Van Heekeren, the survey and the collection, this archaeological work, that was that must have been it for him, because he has a quote here where he says, in his own writing, on only a very few occasions were we allowed to swim across, this is the Mekong River at that time, and to make hasty, albeit fruitless, investigations on the opposite shore. So that really implies that he asked the Japanese specifically if he could brave a river, swim across it so that he could survey for archaeological artifacts. And these are some really nice stone tools that he recovered essentially during his work on the line. And so, he talks about, and you can get a sense just knowing the experience, that when they were excavating through different types of deposits, trying to get material, trying to move sands and sediments, for example, he was keeping an eye out for stone tools and different types of features and habitation sites, essentially conducting archaeological survey. Probably what's even more remarkable about this is that he kept some of these stone tools, he kept them in the camp with him, a larger collection than what's shown here. And somehow he was able to transport them to Japan and actually keep them until after the war. And it's a little bit murky, the records, there's so much more to learn about him, I think, because some of this is still a little bit unknown, but a friend or a colleague or a fellow POW, the Japanese confiscated some of these stone tools when he was moved to a POW camp in Japan. Somehow, though, he got them back after the war, and he eventually donated them to the Peabody Museum in Harvard here in the United States. And this is, to me, just again, it really speaks to, he was 40 years old at the time when he was captured and essentially forced to work on the railroad, and yet he was able to keep this interest in and really work on the archaeology at that time of sort of Thailand while he was prisoner. And he kept this through his time, even in Japan. Again, he was probably transported on one of these hell ships. That's the way that the Japanese transported prisoners during those days. And he was able to keep these collections. And then these collections became incorporated into well-known, quite famous museum collection, and they have become sort of a source of information about the prehistory and the archaeological record of Thailand. So the fact that all of this was possible and that he did this knowing the conditions that he lived through is really, I think, something that's remarkably intriguing. And so we'll come back to him in a moment here. But this is where I wanted to kind of segue into the film. If you have seen The Bridge on the River Kwai, or if you see it after this talk, perhaps it's probably quite obvious, where some of the critiques of the film come from. They tried to make a wholehearted attempt, I think, to capture the experience of POWs at that time and sort of the enormity and the gravity of their situation, especially, having no equipment, having to build these, engineering feats, essentially. But the film has been critiqued in different ways because of this perhaps emphasis it puts on, kind of the honor and sort of the responsibility of the prisoners to essentially build this and keep it in existence. This idea that that Alec Guinness, I'll show a photo of him again here in a second, but sort of would be so, whatever the right word might be, sad or upset that they're going to blow the span of the bridge, essentially destroy it after all the work that they did put into it. That is where some of the conflict comes in. And of course, I can't imagine when this film was released in 1957 that it was easy to capture, 12 years essentially after the war, maybe the true brutality of that existence. It might be something, and I would recommend, if any of you have your sort of Hollywood colleagues and friends, to push them to remake this movie, because there's a story here about survival and about the existence of the POWs and their experience, which is really important, I think, in this fictionalized and dramatized version, which was based off of a novel, a fictional novel of essentially these events in Thailand and Burma during the war. It doesn't really do justice to the suffering. It might be impossible, though, to really ever truly capture sort of on screen the suffering that these POWs experienced. But again, this film, it really tried to represent this time. And for better or for worse, this is the film that most people can connect to when they think about this China-Burma-India theater, when they think about war in the Second World War in Southeast Asia. This is really what is tied to it. This is kind of the cultural phenomenon that provides a frame of reference. And so it's important, it's significant, but again, it it sort of fails to capture the true dynamics of this experience. And of course, here's Alec Guinness sort of playing the famous colonel after being put in this heat box, and of course they tried to show the malnourishment. They tried to depict this in certain ways, but it's this complicated relationship between Allied POWs and the Japanese commander at that time, and the real Japanese commander is sort of this infamous character that's really the struggle. And I think that over time, over the 20th century, even into the 21st century, the perception of this film and the way that people have engaged with it has likely changed. And I think, now people understand it for what it is, this attempt to represent, through a Hollywood story, essentially what was going on during that time. And something I do like to note when thinking about this is that they filmed on site in Sri Lanka. And so they did experience the cast and crew essentially. Someone actually died from the crew, if I understand correctly, during filming. There were injuries. They suffered some of the same diseases. They caught infections. So they did have a sort of a small, very, very small piece of the experience that POWs suffered while even trying to make this film. But again, it's not it needs to be understood with the caveat that Hollywood is dramatizing really important piece of history and really a consequential sort of experience during the Second World War, especially within this broader theater. So going back to Van Heekeren, he's just a remarkable character to me. I really have always been sort of in awe and inspired equally by his work and his time. He after the war, he returned to Europe. He also returned back to Indonesia to complete some more archaeological research. In 1947, he published his piece in the Illustrated London News. Again, he's talking about sort of the archaeology that he did while as prisoner of war working on the Railroad of Death. And he talks about the Railroad of Death and sort of some of these experiences, but his interest is really on trying to publish and inform the public on the really important, prehistoric record in Thailand and Southeast Asia that he was able to identify and other POWs helped him identify during that time. And he wrote, not in this newspaper article, but in a paper published shortly afterwards, he said, "I hope that this paper will inspire other archaeologists to investigate that country," speaking of Thailand, "on a larger scale, better equipped and under more favorable circumstances." And I don't know, I'm not too sure. I try to imagine his character sometimes, to put it so kindly, to say under more favorable circumstances. After the small snippet that I've shared here about really the disturbing, the traumatic experience of POWs, and for him to come back and say under more favorable circumstances, there could probably be some really interesting archaeology that could be done. And I think it speaks to him as a sort of an individual and his experience and also his scholarship and his interest in trying to make this record transparent, I suppose maybe is one way to say it, or at least available to the world, to the broader public. And so he was really excited in 1960, essentially 16 years after he left Thailand. He was invited by a famous team out of Denmark to work on this Thai-Danish expedition to go to the places where he was prisoner of war, to return to that same environment, to the same river, to those same essentially rock shelters and sites and areas that he dug through and suffered in, I am sure, between 42 and 43. And he returned to complete archaeological research with this team. And this is, again, if we think back to that map, you can imagine the railroad, essentially, Three Pagodas Pass. This is a really infamous pass on the Thai-Burma border. This is the route of the railroad that it took, and this is essentially this drainage, this river drainage here. This is what the Japanese followed. This is why there are so many bridges, and this is the environment. And you can see here this is published in 1967, but this is a survey map showing all of these individual sites. And several of these sites he actually discovered and identified while he was POW, just through his work, day to day, sort of keeping that open mind, perhaps is one way to say it, and trying to discover and identify this record and this evidence from this portion of Thailand. He excavated a very famous site called Cyler Rock Shelter. This, again, was in 1960 and published later in the 1960s. This is a sort of looking at the front, so a profile view. You can see the shelter here, trying to depict essentially this limestone karstic environment, which is ideal for caves and rock shelters. You can see here the excavation units. I'm going to show a couple of images here from section A and section C, just to give you a sense of sort of the depth of the excavation. But, this was post-war archaeology in Thailand. It was one of the first, really, maybe if not the first. I have to catch myself there. Nothing is ever really the first, I think, but I was one of the first sort of systematic, collaborative international archaeological projects in Thailand in the post-war era. And it, I sometimes think that his work doesn't really get the credit it should receive, because he did a lot of things that were quite consequential. And the team that he was working with, they excavated, they published, they were lacking some critical elements. For example, at this time, radiocarbon dating had been discovered. There were very few to no radiocarbon dates essentially within Southeast Asia during this time. And so he did not have radiocarbon dates for this rock shelter. And this is a profile sequence. So this is really classic archaeological work. You can see this nice battleship curve showing the abundance of what he called stone refuse during this time. Bones, shells, ceramics, axes, all of these different types of items that they're excavating, that they're mapping into the stratigraphy, to the stratigraphic profile. This is the mainstay. This is archaeology. This is what we're trained to do. And he was doing this so early on in the 1960s with this international team. And what still is just so shocking to me, it's hard to fathom, is that he was returning intentionally by choice and with excitement, as you can see from his writing and what he describes, to this area where he suffered as a POW during the war. But it was such an important area for understanding the human prehistory, the human activities and tropical adaptations within Southeast Asia. He simply could not help himself. He writes about how excited he was to return. And so I think it's quite remarkable. And this is just an example, again, of sort of some of the early profound work that he did to try and publish and inform the community of these really exciting and interesting sites. Again, this is an environment, that we might imagine this from some of these POW photos, right? This is 1960. These are some of the units, really at this time, classic archaeological excavation, where you keep these large balks in between these larger open units. Pardon me. But this is showing this jungle environment. These trails that they probably took to access up. This is the rock shelter is essentially at the bottom part of this. So this is the talus slope coming off. You can see here, this is section A or sector A and sector C. So you can see here the rock shelter wall on this side, rock shelter wall on this side. This is sort of the depth. It gives you some idea of the scale, but just really, at the time, this was, I think, groundbreaking research that they were conducting. These really large scale, systematic for their time archaeological excavations in these areas that had experienced such a profound trauma of the human experience during the war. And this is some in situ, what's called this Hoabinian stone tool complex. If you're familiar with these similar types of stone tool complexes, Clovis, for example, in North America, or could be a comparable type of idea for just thinking that this is a very well-known, well-studied, although sort of misunderstood, lithic stone tool complex that's found throughout Southeast Asia. And these are some artifacts that we found in situ while excavating this rock shelter. I think that if this was I have some Southeast Asia colleagues, thank you for coming. I'm quite grateful. If I were to say, show this chart right here, for example, this visual that he published in the 60s at a modern day conference, I might get kicked out of the room. This is certainly 100% incorrect, sort of this understanding, this cultural sequence. There are some general things about this that are accurate, but I wanted to put it in here because, again, when we think about his experience as POW, sort of his work as an archaeologist, what he did during the war, 15, 16 years later, coming back to complete this work again and to sort of to expand it. This is something that he published in this report, trying to really create this cultural chronological sequence and trying to understand the really human adaptation, the development, sort of the culture of this area of mainland Southeast Asia. And that's why his work, I think, is really critical and important to understand within mainland Southeast Asia, because it helped to establish this context, which was so critical for the people, both his contemporaries and those after him, for understanding and having a baseline to work off of. And I think he might not be given as much credit as he could for sort of the really what I think was groundbreaking work to try and establish an idea, sort of a sequence of thoughts about what could be within this area, and to provide very clear record of that evidence so that others could come back and test this. And I should note that his collections remain essentially untested today. I think that it's sort of part of the story, but also a small tragedy that his work, although it was published and well known at the time, that folks have not gone back to essentially reinvestigate those assemblages that are, I believe, still in Denmark today. Just talking with folks at the Danish National Museum. So this is really a significant record, and it's what he helped establish. I'm going to speed up here because I see we're getting close to running out of time. So I wanted to just add in a few more slides here, trying to tie in sort of the legacy and the significance. When I did my archaeological work, my dissertation in Southeast Asia, I was working in northern Thailand. This is a photo of Chester Gorman. He was an archaeologist who was working also in the 60s, but essentially the generation after Van Heekeren. He came in, and sort of wanted to test a lot of these ideas that were being studied by Van Heekeren and his contemporaries and colleagues just south of him in sort of central and western Thailand. I went back and studied his materials and his collections from Northwest Thailand for my own dissertation, and again approached these same types of questions that were of interest during that time in 1960 and sort of throughout the 60s, that were really fundamental in shifting and sort of crafting the world of archaeology that we know within Southeast Asia. And so I wanted to add this in because I think it talks about the influence and the trajectory of Van Heekeren and sort of his legacy within Southeast Asia. And again, this is one of the sites that in the previous slide, Chester Gorman, Chet Gorman excavated. You can see here a similar type of sequence with balks in between these units. If you look back at his research proposals at Chet Gorman's dissertation, things that I studied to try and understand and restudy and analyze his collections from this site, which was one of them. He was also influenced by the work that Van Heekeren did and others at that time. And so again, there's just a really interesting legacy, and it was through his experience. I think this is so critical. It was through his experience as a POW that he was able to find some of these early items, and that drew him back to Thailand to complete really this fundamental work. And that's why the war really still is a really important element of the story. When I had my first field school, this was with Ben Marwick at the University of Washington. We excavated a rock shelter called Khao To Chung Rock Shelter, and this was actually south of essentially where this railroad of death would have been. But again, you can see this is I want to show this photo just to show, Van Heekeren and his colleagues, they were probably excavating similar types of rock shelters, these large karstic environments. They're excavating out the shelter floors. This is similar to what Chet Gorman was doing, and others throughout the 20th century, sort of working in these karstic environments where preservation is better than often these sort of open air areas within jungles, and really trying to understand this human record of existence within mainland Southeast Asia. And even more so, I think that if we take a step back and think about archaeology and perhaps the legacy of war within Southeast Asia, the intersections are really important, I think, and fundamental to sort of understanding the complexity and also the traumas that have been experienced by peoples within this landscape and sort of how we're studying those environments. And so this is a really fascinating paper by Nicholas Roberts talking about caves and cave systems, and this is in Laos. But this is a photo during what's known in Southeast Asia as the American War in Vietnam, or of course known here as the Vietnam War, but using caves, using these environments where past peoples, hunter-gatherers, were subsisting and living, and these were their shelters, these were their places where they were coming to stay. And yet we see centuries, millennia later, essentially, that individuals are still reusing these environments. And in this case, it's because of of this warfare, and of the violence in the environment and the landscape. And so similar to Van Heekeren and sort of his work as a sort of, I say his work, but his forced labor as a prisoner of war on the railroad, again, this is an environment that's shaped by the warfare that occurred during the 20th century. Archaeology has a role to play with the HMS Perth, the cruiser, and also the Houston. The Perth, though, again, very shallow. She rests in only about 85 feet of water. And so there's been a really tragic record of looting and of desecration of essentially this memorial of this burial ground of the sailors who perished during that battle in, sort of February 28th and March 1st of 1942, which I failed to mention, but we just passed the 80th anniversary, which again is difficult to sort of conceptualize how many years and decades it's been since these very relevant and prevalent sort of activities and histories occurred, and they really are still consequential today. And so, of course, there's a lot of debate about the protection of this space as sort of a sacred area for those sailors who lost their lives, but the archaeology and sort of this idea of ecotourism and maritime tourism. And so, again, there's these intersections that are still present. And Joan Beaumont out of Australian National University, this is my last example here, but she published an essay in 2013, this idea of a cultural route. And again, this is sort of portion of Hellfire Pass. This was a really interesting perspective, because the idea is that, the railroad itself was partially destroyed after the war. Essentially it just was not worth the effort. And the Allies had destroyed so much of it, it was not worth the effort to rebuild it. Eventually, on the Thai side, they kept portions of it and rebuilt portions of it to create a connection essentially from Bangkok to portions of Western Thailand and Kanchanaburi. But this idea of a cultural route, this environment, where past peoples, hunter-gatherers, were for thousands and thousands of years of human existence within this area, they use this environment, the violence and the trauma of the war, and sort of cutting this route, creating this railroad. After the war, it was broken down, parts of it were intentionally destroyed. Now it's a memorial, but it also serves as an active functional route for peoples, again, sort of Thai peoples and peoples living in that part of Southeast Asia. And so it is still really an important kind of cultural concept, and the route itself really holds a lot of sort of significance for people around the world. And so she has this really interesting essay and thesis, talking about the railroad, and it's much more than just what happened during the war, but the war plays such an important role in shaping our understanding of this space over time. Okay, so with this, I just wanted to post this last slide. Again, it's St. Patrick's Day. I piped for Bob. He passed away in 2010. But sort of this experience and this interview and what he shared with me during this time, I just wanted to put this up here, both for St. Patrick's Day, but more importantly, to really, sort of remember Bob and the influence that he had on me in trying to really understand this long-term record of how humans have lived in, interacted with, and experienced essentially the tropics of Southeast Asia. And I think that's just a kind of a key concept throughout this whole story. Okay, thank you. I know I went over, I apologize, but I'm so grateful to all of you for listening, and thank you so much. And Andy and Cindy and the Society and many others, I really appreciate everything. So I'm happy to be quiet now and take any questions that come up.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's really an amazing story. I think we're all a little amazed. I'd heard some of it myself in the past, and a long time ago saw the movie, but it really is a lot to think about. It is heartening that you were able to show, after such a horrific a tale during this period, that positive things did come out of it for archaeology. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more to start us off. And for those of you who have questions, if you'd like to place them in the chat box, we can answer them as we go along. But I thought perhaps you might say a little something about the later career of the archaeologist. whose name I mispronounced.
Sorry about that. I know it's a hard name. I always have to catch myself. I want to put in the C. Van Heekeren. Hendrik Robert van Heekeren. Hopefully I'm off of mute. I'm just having some trouble with that button. But yeah, he, essentially in 1960, 61, I think maybe even through 1963, although I could be wrong, but he was in Thailand. He was doing work excavating sites and working within that area. He, after that project ended, they published on that work. There were several publications that came out of it. He completed some more archaeological work, I believe, in Europe and Southeast Asia, but he eventually died. He died a short time later. I think it was 1974, if I'm remembering the date that I put on there correctly. So it was a short time after he was able to publish some of this work in Southeast Asia that he passed away. And he was in Holland, I believe, in Leiden, I think, is where he passed away. But his career, to me, I know that he went back to Indonesia and completed a lot of work in Indonesia, and he's quite well known there. And I think perhaps even more so than in Thailand, his work in Indonesia was really foundational for some of the archaeology that came after him. But I think his work in Thailand was an important culmination, contribution of especially his time as a prisoner in the camps.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we were opening it up for questions. I don't see any in the chat box at the moment. Oh, I do see one from Craig Conrad. Was Van, here now I'll mispronounce it again.
That's okay.
Heekeren story in the early cuts of the movie.
So this is my dad. Thank you, Dad, for bringing in a question here. I think I know, I'm remembering now what you're referencing, and I failed to mention this. So there is a story that was published when he passed away in his obituary, which is that a young archaeologist who I believe is still alive, his name's Carl Hyder, he had been influenced by essentially a Paleolithic record out of Burma, sort of prior to the war. A lot of really ancient types of stone tools, for example. He went to this region of Thailand in the 50s and discovered some possible sites, discovered some later Neolithic sites, a lot of important ceramic pottery styles, for example. So as the story goes, he was actually a graduate student, and when they were filming, they shot some scenes with him as an archaeologist to play the role of Van Heekeren, and to essentially, he swam across a river, I think, and like collected some rocks. And so they took some footage of him doing that to include in the film to try and represent the story. Apparently it was cut, and I was able to get in touch with some folks at Sony years and years ago, and they told me that in those days, they never kept the footage. But I would say that I'm partially skeptical as the years have gone by that story is accurate, because the filming, Hyder was in Thailand during that time, but the filming occurred in Sri Lanka. And so I'm not too sure, perhaps he was in Sri Lanka. I've never been able to clarify the story, but there was apparently an attempt to include him in the film, and it just was not, it was cut essentially.
Interesting. Brian Buchanan, our colleague from over at Eastern Washington, thanks you for an excellent talk, and he's curious to know whether there's been archaeological or forensic anthropology of the POW camps and or the rail lines looking for Allied servicemen remains.
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. I thank you for that question. I have reached out to some folks. There's a local museum. There are some, essentially some veterans, especially a couple of Australian service members who are veterans who run a local museum. The Thai Fine Arts Department, I think, also has a local museum, and they have some collections that have been made over the years, as I understand it, of bits and pieces of portions of the rail spikes that have been recovered. I think there's even a spike in a museum here in the United States in reference to the USS Houston survivors. So there's been a little bit of work, but one of the challenges is that there was such a, the record is, everything that they were using was organic, is kind of how the story goes. And so there were so few items that could preserve or would preserve in that environment that although I have always wanted to conduct some archaeological work to actually try and find these camps and sort of, reconstruct some idea of what was going on. There has not been a big effort or push, and there has not been a lot of work that's ever been done. And it's, I think it's driven by this thought that there's just so few material items that would have been preserved because they essentially had nothing but the clothes on their back and bamboo, and there is just not a lot to preserve in that type of environment. So it's I'm not too sure how accurate that might be. I think archaeology needs to we need to go out there and actually test it, but it hasn't happened yet.
Oh, I can imagine that would be a very difficult endeavor, especially given what you were telling us about the environment there.
Yeah.
Rolanda Webb mentions, again, thanking you for your talk, and mentions that it would be interesting to overlay current images of the railway to the original lines.
Yeah, that's actually a great idea. I'm sorry I didn't do that. I should have done that. Yeah, there's a portion on the Thai side, which has been preserved and essentially is where the modern railroad exists today. It's been updated and changed over the years a little bit, but it's once you get into the dense forested areas, sort of the regrown areas, a little bit further to the west near Three Pagodas Pass and on the Burmese side, where a lot of the line, it's been tracked and marked, and folks have gone out and they know where it is, but there's not a lot of evidence still there of it. But yeah, that would be a great idea. I'll have to remember that. Thank you.
We still have a little time for some questions, but I was kind of hoping to ask is, you did mention, and I think quite correctly, a number of times about civilian deaths associated with this entire event. Are those memorialized? Are those understood? I mean, you were saying it, this is a forgotten war in some ways, and yet I would imagine or hope that in those regions, this is still quite well remembered.
Yep. Yeah, that's entirely accurate. In those regions of Thailand, and perhaps also Burma, I should ask some colleagues, but they are memorialized. There are spaces, especially at these museums and these cultural centers, that are remembering, especially the large numbers of civilians that were killed during that time. But their story is really, still unwritten. I think a lot of survivors, because there were roughly 60,000 Allied POWs, and roughly, let's say, 45,000 of them survived. There are numerous written records, interviews, historical, documentation of what folks experienced during this time. And the USS Houston survivors, there's a great book called Ship of Ghosts that really, has gone through all of the survivor records, essentially, that could be collected to document all of this. But it just, I am unaware of those same records for the civilian population. And, and sometimes there are descriptions that entire villages essentially were wiped out along this portion of the line, often because of disease. It really was the disease in the environment that was introduced because of the conditions in the Japanese camps that really killed off so many people. So it's something that remains, I think, to be accomplished, perhaps in a more holistic type of way.
Great. Well, thank you for your wonderful lecture this evening. It is time for us to go, but I did want to note, for those of you who are still with us, that our next talk will be a hybrid talk. Once again, we will be in person at the MAC, as well as online at this same Zoom address. So you can join us either way on April 21st at 6:30 p.m. When Stephen Nash will talk about Nagpra and objects from the Denver Museum. So for those of you who have joined us, thank you again for coming. Thank you, a virtual hand clapping, and great thank you to Cyler for telling us about this really amazing experience. And again, we look forward to having you back again for another one of your talks. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you. And we'll see you all next month.
Thanks again. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.